In a quiet little town nestled in the southern United States, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The streets were lined with old oak trees, their branches stretching wide like protective arms over the small houses below. Among the residents was Walter Thompson, a 72-year-old black man who had lived in the town for most of his life. Walter wasn't someone who sought attention. He preferred to keep to himself, finding joy in simple pleasures like tending to his garden, reading books about history, and occasionally chatting with neighbors who admired his wisdom. Walter's life hadn't always been easy. Growing up in the 1950s and 60s, he had faced racism and discrimination at every turn. He remembered sitting at segregated lunch counters as a teenager, participating in peaceful protests during the civil rights movement, and enduring insults simply because of the color of his skin. Despite these hardships, Walter had learned to navigate the world with grace and resilience. He believed in treating others with kindness, even when they didn't extend the same courtesy to him. Over time, he became known in the community as a man of integrity and patience, someone who carried himself with dignity no matter the circumstances. On this particular day, Walter woke up early, as he always did. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the dew-covered grass in his backyard. He sipped a cup of coffee while flipping through the pages of an old novel, its cover worn from years of use. After finishing his breakfast, Walter decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It was something he did often, a chance to stretch his legs, clear his mind, and enjoy the fresh air. Little did he know, this seemingly ordinary stroll would turn into one of the most unforgettable experiences of his life. As Walter strolled down the sidewalk, he noticed 2 police cars parked near the corner store. At first glance, it seemed like a routine patrol. Officers often drove through the area to check for any signs of trouble, though the neighborhood was generally peaceful. Walter thought nothing of it and continued on his way, humming softly to himself. But then, out of nowhere, 2 officers stepped out of their vehicles and approached him. Their body language was tense, almost hostile, as if they were preparing for a confrontation. "Sir, where are you headed?" one of the officers asked, his tone sharp and demanding. Walter stopped walking and looked at them calmly. "I'm just taking a walk," he replied, his voice steady. "Is there a problem?" The officers exchanged glances before one of them spoke again. "Do you live around here? Can we see some ID?" Walter felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He had been through situations like this before, moments where authority figures questioned his presence simply because of the color of his skin. Still, he tried to remain composed. "Yes, I live a few blocks away," he said, pulling out his wallet to show them his driver's license. "I've lived here for decades." But the officers weren't satisfied. They began asking more questions, their tone growing increasingly aggressive. One of them made a comment about people like you causing problems in the community, implying that Walter might be involved in some kind of illegal activity. Walter clenched his jaw but forced himself to stay calm. He knew better than to argue with armed officers, especially when they were already predisposed to view him as a threat. Despite his cooperation, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. One of the officers accused Walter of matching the description of a suspect in a recent burglary, a claim that made no sense. Walter hadn't left his house all morning except to check his mailbox, and the so-called description was vague at best. Yet the officers refused to listen, insisting they needed to search him. Walter reluctantly agreed, knowing that resisting could lead to even worse consequences. As the officers patted him down, their comments became more condescending. Passers-by slowed their steps to watch the scene unfold, some looking uncomfortable while others avoided eye contact altogether. When the search yielded nothing incriminating, the officers still wouldn't let him go. Instead, they issued him a citation for loitering, despite the fact that Walter was simply walking in his own neighborhood. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the ticket, but he held his head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply their actions had wounded him. When Walter finally returned home, he sat in his favorite armchair, replaying the incident over and over in his mind. He felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, frustration, but also something else: determination. This wasn't the first time Walter had faced racism, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But he also knew that he couldn't let such blatant injustice go unchallenged. After calming himself with a cup of tea, Walter picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. On the other end of the line was Judge Evelyn Carter, a childhood friend who had risen to prominence as one of the most respected judges in the state. Walter briefly explained what had happened, emphasizing the blatant racism and abuse of power. Judge Carter listened intently, her voice firm yet compassionate. She assured Walter she would look into the matter immediately and promised to ensure justice was served. Hanging up the phone, Walter felt a flicker of hope amid the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to fight, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. And as he gazed out the window at the setting sun, Walter reminded himself of the lessons he had learned throughout his life: patience, perseverance, and the unwavering belief that change was possible, no matter how long it took. The next morning, Walter woke up with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there in years. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on his mind, but instead of letting bitterness consume him, he channeled his energy into action. He knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. He was going up against people who held power and authority, but Walter had faced bigger challenges before. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Judge Evelyn Carter's promise to help gave him hope, and he trusted her completely. They had grown up together, and though their lives had taken different paths, their bond remained strong. After finishing his breakfast, Walter sat down at his kitchen table and began writing. For hours he poured his thoughts onto paper, carefully, documenting every detail of the encounter with the officers. He described how they approached him, the questions they asked, the tone of their voices, and the accusations they hurled at him without evidence. He noted the names on their badges, the license plate numbers of their patrol cars, and even the reactions of bystanders who witnessed the incident. Walter wanted to leave no stone unturned. If this case went to court or became public, he needed to have everything ready. As he wrote, flashes of anger would occasionally flare up inside him. How dare they treat him like a criminal? How could they dismiss his dignity so casually? But each time those feelings bubbled to the surface, Walter took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was doing this. It wasn't just about seeking justice for himself. It was about standing up for all the others who had suffered similar indignities but didn't have the means or opportunity to fight back. By telling his story, Walter hoped to shine a light on the systemic issues that allowed such abuse to happen in the first place. Later that afternoon, Judge Carter called Walter to update him on her progress. She had already reviewed the details he shared and was working behind the scenes to gather more information. "I've spoken to a few colleagues," she told him over the phone, "and we're looking into whether these officers have a history of misconduct. If they do, it will strengthen our case significantly." Her voice was calm but firm, filled with the same determination Walter felt in his heart. Judge Carter also informed Walter that surveillance footage from nearby businesses might exist. Cameras were mounted outside the corner store and a few other establishments along the street where the incident occurred. If the footage captured what happened, it could serve as undeniable proof of the officer's behavior. Walter thanked her for her efforts and promised to send her copies of the documents he had prepared. Before hanging up, Judge Carter offered some advice. "Stay safe, Walter. Don't engage with them unless absolutely necessary. Let me handle this." With renewed resolve, Walter spent the rest of the day organizing his notes and preparing for the battle ahead. He printed out copies of his written account, attached photographs of his neighborhood, and included contact information for potential witnesses. He even reached out to a local journalist he knew from years ago, a young woman named Sarah who had interviewed him once for a feature on civil rights activists in the community. Walter explained the situation briefly and asked if she'd be willing to look into it. Sarah agreed immediately, promising to investigate further and write an article if warranted. Meanwhile, news of the incident began spreading through the town. Neighbors who had seen what happened whispered about it during their daily routines. Some expressed outrage, while others seemed hesitant to speak out, fearing retaliation or conflict. But one person decided to take a stand. Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly white woman who lived across the street from Walter. She had watched the entire scene unfold from her front porch and couldn't believe her eyes. When she saw Walter later that evening, she walked over to his house to offer her support. "Walter, I'm so sorry for what those men did to you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It was wrong, so terribly wrong. If you need anything, please let me know. I'll testify if you want me to." Her words brought tears to Walter's eyes. In a world often divided by fear and prejudice, moments of genuine kindness reminded him why he kept fighting. He hugged Mrs. Jenkins tightly and thanked her for her courage. "You don't know how much this means to me," he said softly. "Together, we can make a difference." That night, as Walter lay in bed, he thought about the ripple effect his actions might create. Confronting racism wasn't just about holding individuals accountable. It was about challenging the systems and attitudes that allowed such behavior to persist. Walter understood that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he believed that every step forward mattered. Whether it was speaking truth to power, inspiring others to join the cause, or simply refusing to stay silent, Walter knew he was planting seeds of hope that could grow into something greater. The following day, Sarah, the journalist, arrived at Walter's house armed with a notebook and recorder. She listened intently as he recounted the events, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes. By the end of their conversation, she assured Walter that she would dig deeper into the matter and reach out to the police department for comment. "This is important," she said earnestly. "People need to know what's happening here, as I." Sarah left. Walter felt a mix of emotions, hope, anxiety, and anticipation. He knew the road ahead would be bumpy, but he also knew he was doing the right thing. For decades, he had taught young people in his community the importance of standing up for justice even when it was difficult. Now he was living those lessons himself, proving that age was no barrier to making a difference. In the days that followed, Walter continued to prepare for whatever came next. He stayed in close contact with Judge Carter, who kept him updated on her findings. Surveillance footage had indeed been retrieved, and it showed exactly what Walter had described: 2 officers harassing an elderly black man without cause. The images were powerful, capturing not only their actions but also the shock and discomfort of onlookers. Armed with this evidence, Judge Carter began drafting formal complaints against the officers, ensuring that their superiors and the public would see the truth. At the same time, Sarah published her article in the local newspaper, titled, "A Walk. Interrupted Elderly Man Faces Racist Harassment by Police." The piece quickly gained attention. Readers were outraged, flooding the paper's office with calls and emails demanding accountability. Social media buzzed with discussions about racial profiling and police brutality, with many pointing out that Walter's experience was far from unique. The article also highlighted statements from witnesses like Mrs. Jenkins, whose testimony added credibility to Walter's claims. As the story gained traction, Walter received messages of support from people across the country. Strangers sent letters thanking him for his bravery, while activists invited him to speak at rallies and forums. Though flattered, Walter remained humble, reminding everyone that the focus should be on systemic change rather than individual heroics. "This isn't about me," he often said. "It's about creating a world where no one has to go through what I did." Despite the growing momentum, Walter knew the hardest part was yet to come. The officers involved would undoubtedly try to defend themselves, perhaps even attempting to discredit him. But Walter was ready. With Judge Carter by his side, a mountain of evidence backing him up, and a community rallying around him, he felt stronger than ever. Whatever happened next, he was determined to face it head-on, knowing that his fight was part of something much larger, a movement toward equality, fairness, and respect for all human beings. And so, Walter Thompson, the quiet gardener and lifelong advocate for justice, found himself at the center of a storm. But unlike storms that pass and leave destruction in their wake, this one carried the promise of renewal. As Walter looked out his window at the budding flowers in his garden, he smiled, knowing that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance could bloom into something extraordinary. The days that followed Sarah's article were a whirlwind of activity for Walter. The small, quiet life he had once known seemed like a distant memory, as his phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, activists, and concerned citizens. At first, Walter felt overwhelmed by the attention. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the thought of addressing large groups of people made him nervous. But deep down he knew this was an opportunity, a chance to amplify his voice and shine a light on the injustices so many others had endured in silence. One morning, as Walter sat at his kitchen table sipping coffee, Judge Evelyn Carter called with an update. "Walter, I've submitted the formal complaints against the officers," she said, her tone both serious and reassuring. "Their superiors are reviewing the case, but I wanted you to know that we're not stopping there. I've also reached out to the Department of Justice. If this is part of a pattern, they need to investigate." Walter nodded even though she couldn't see him. "Thank you, Evelyn," he replied. "I trust you completely. Just tell me what I need to do next." Evelyn hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "There's something else, Walter. The department is likely going to call you in for questioning. They'll want to hear your side of the story officially. Are you prepared for that?" Walter took a deep breath. He had expected this step, but hearing it confirmed still sent a shiver down his spine. "I'm ready," he said firmly. "Whatever they throw at me, I'll handle it. I've lived through worse." Evelyn praised his courage and reminded him that she would accompany him during the questioning if needed. With her guidance, Walter began preparing mentally for the meeting. He reviewed his notes, rehearsed his answers, and practiced staying calm under pressure. He knew the officers might try to twist his words or paint him as uncooperative, but he refused to let them rattle him. Meanwhile, the town was abuzz with conversations about Walter's case. The newspaper article had ignited a firestorm of debate. Some residents supported Walter wholeheartedly, praising him for standing up against injustice. Others, however, dismissed the incident as a misunderstanding, claiming the officers were just doing their job. A few even accused Walter of exaggerating the situation to gain sympathy. These conflicting opinions highlighted the deep divisions within the community, but they also underscored the importance of addressing systemic racism head-on. At a local cafe, a group of neighbors gathered to discuss the issue over cups of coffee. Among them was Mrs. Jenkins, who hadn't stopped advocating for Walter since witnessing the incident. She shared her account of what happened, her voice passionate and unwavering. "I saw everything," she told the group. "Those officers treated Walter like a criminal because of the color of his skin. It was wrong, plain and simple, and if we don't speak up now, it will happen again to someone else." Her words resonated with some, but others remained skeptical. One man argued that the officers were probably just following protocol, while another suggested that Walter should have complied more quickly to avoid trouble. The discussion grew heated, with voices rising and tempers flaring. But amidst the chaos, one young woman named Lisa stood up and spoke quietly, yet firmly. "It doesn't matter what anyone thinks happened," she said. "What matters is how we move forward. We can't keep ignoring these problems. If we truly care about justice, we have to listen to people like Walter and work together to create change." Lisa's words struck a chord, and the room fell silent for a moment. Though not everyone agreed, her perspective forced them to reflect on their own biases and assumptions. For Walter, this kind of dialogue, however uncomfortable, was exactly what he hoped to inspire. Change rarely came without discomfort, and challenging long-held beliefs was often the first step toward progress. As the week went on, Walter received invitations to speak at various events. Local churches, schools, and community organizations wanted him to share his story and offer insights into combating racism. At first, Walter hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his forte, and he worried about saying the wrong thing. But after much thought and encouragement from friends like Evelyn and Mrs. Jenkins, he decided to accept a few invitations. He realized that his experiences could serve as a powerful tool for education and inspiration. His first speaking engagement was at a nearby high school. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and parents eager to hear what Walter had to say. As he walked onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. Walter smiled nervously, but felt a surge of gratitude. He began by sharing his childhood memories of segregation and the civil rights movement, explaining how those experiences shaped his worldview. Then he recounted the recent encounter with the officers, describing how it made him feel and why he chose to fight back. "I'm not here to tell you that racism is easy to overcome," Walter said, his voice steady and heartfelt. "It's painful, exhausting, and sometimes it feels like the world is working against you. But I'm also here to tell you that your voice matters. Standing up for what's right isn't always comfortable, but it's necessary. Together, we can make a difference, not just for ourselves but for future generations." When he finished speaking, the audience gave him a standing ovation. Many students approached him afterward, thanking him for his courage and asking how they could help. Walter encouraged them to educate themselves, engage in respectful conversations, and support marginalized communities in meaningful ways. Seeing the enthusiasm and determination in their eyes filled him with hope. Back home, Walter reflected on the impact his story was having. He never imagined that a single act of defiance could spark such widespread awareness and action. Yet, despite the progress, he remained cautious. He knew that systemic change required more than headlines and applause. It demanded sustained effort and accountability. That's why he continued working closely with Judge Carter and other allies to ensure the officers involved faced consequences for their actions. A few days later, Walter received a letter from the police department, requesting his presence for an official interview. The timing couldn't have been better. The surveillance footage had been analyzed, witness statements had been collected, and public pressure was mounting. Walter met with Evelyn beforehand to go over the details one last time. She reminded him to stick to the facts, remain composed, and avoid letting the officers provoke him. On the day of the interview, Walter arrived at the police station dressed neatly and carrying a folder filled with his documentation. The atmosphere inside was tense, with officers glancing at him curiously as he entered the room designated for the meeting. 2 senior detectives were waiting for him, their expressions unreadable. Evelyn sat beside Walter, her presence providing a sense of security. The questioning began with basic inquiries about Walter's whereabouts on the day of the incident. Walter answered calmly and confidently, sticking to his prepared responses. When the detectives tried to challenge his version of events, pointing out minor inconsistencies in his timeline, Walter remained unfazed. "I've provided all the evidence you need," he said evenly. "If my word isn't enough, then perhaps you should focus on improving your training programs instead of targeting innocent citizens." His comment caught the detectives off guard, and for a brief moment the room fell silent. Walter seized the opportunity to reiterate his main points: the lack of probable cause, the racist remarks, and the unnecessary citation. By the end of the session, it was clear that Walter had held his ground admirably. Even the detectives seemed impressed by his composure and clarity. After leaving the station, Walter felt a wave of relief wash over him. The hardest part was finally behind him, or so he thought. What he didn't realize was that the real battle was just beginning. The officers' union had already begun mounting a defense, arguing that the accusations were exaggerated and politically motivated. Meanwhile, supporters of law enforcement criticized Walter for attacking the police force, accusing him of undermining public safety. Despite the backlash, Walter refused to back down. He leaned on his network of friends, family, and advocates for strength, drawing inspiration from their unwavering support. Together, they planned rallies, petition drives, and educational workshops aimed at fostering understanding and promoting reform. Walter also collaborated with Sarah, the journalist, to produce follow-up articles highlighting similar cases across the country. Each new development brought fresh challenges, but Walter faced them with resilience and grace. As weeks turned into months, Walter's efforts began bearing fruit. The police department announced disciplinary actions against the officers involved, including suspensions and mandatory sensitivity training. While some viewed these measures as insufficient, Walter saw them as a step in the right direction. More importantly, the incident sparked broader discussions about racial profiling and police accountability, leading to policy changes at both local and state levels. Through it all, Walter remained grounded, focusing on the bigger picture. He understood that true justice wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about creating a fairer, more equitable society. And though the journey was far from over, Walter felt a profound sense of fulfillment knowing that he had played a role in planting seeds of change. As he tended to his garden one evening, watching the sun dip below the weeks following the police department's announcement of disciplinary actions against the officers brought a mix of emotions for Walter. On one hand, he felt a sense of vindication. Finally, there was acknowledgement that what had happened to him was wrong. The suspensions and mandatory training signaled that accountability was possible, even within systems resistant to change. On the other hand, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that justice remained incomplete. Disciplinary measures were important, but they didn't address the deeper roots of systemic racism embedded in law enforcement and society as a whole. Walter spent many evenings reflecting on this paradox. He sat in his favorite armchair, staring out the window at the stars twinkling in the night sky. His mind wandered back to the civil rights movement, when he had marched alongside others who dreamed of equality. Back then, progress had felt monumental, a new law passed here, a discriminatory practice abolished there. But decades later, Walter realized how much work still needed to be done. Racism hadn't disappeared. It had simply adapted, finding subtler ways to manifest itself. It wasn't enough to punish individual officers or implement surface-level reforms. Real change required dismantling harmful structures and rebuilding them from the ground up. Determined to keep pushing forward, Walter threw himself into advocacy work. He partnered with local organizations to host workshops on racial sensitivity and police reform. These events drew diverse crowds, young students eager to learn, seasoned activists sharing their experiences, and even some police officers willing to engage in honest dialogue. Walter approached each gathering with humility and openness, emphasizing the importance of listening and learning from one another. "We're not here to point fingers," he often said. "We're here to understand and grow." One particularly impactful workshop took place at a community center downtown. The room buzzed with energy as attendees filed in, clutching notebooks and pens. Walter stood at the front, flanked by Judge Evelyn Carter and Lisa, the young woman who had spoken so passionately at the cafe. Together, they presented a comprehensive overview of the issues surrounding racial profiling, using Walter's case as a starting point. They showed clips of the surveillance footage, shared testimonies from witnesses, and discussed broader statistics about police misconduct nationwide. After the presentation, the floor opened for questions and discussion. A middle-aged man raised his hand hesitantly. "I'm a retired cop," he began, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "And I'll admit I've made mistakes in my career, judging people based on stereotypes instead of facts. Hearing your story makes me realize how harmful that can be. What advice would you give someone like me who wants to do better?" Walter paused, considering the question carefully. "First, thank you for being brave enough to ask," he replied. "Change starts with self-awareness. Acknowledge where you went wrong and commit to doing things differently moving forward. Educate yourself about cultures and communities outside your own. And most importantly, listen to the people you serve. Their voices matter more than anything else." The man nodded, visibly moved. Others in the audience chimed in, sharing their own stories and insights. By the end of the session, several attendees exchanged contact information, vowing to stay connected and continue the conversation. For Walter, these moments of connection reinforced his belief in the power of collective action. Change might start with individuals, but it thrived through collaboration. Meanwhile, the backlash against Walter intensified. Supporters of the suspended officers launched a campaign to discredit him, spreading false narratives online and accusing him of fabricating the incident. Some claimed he was seeking fame or financial gain, while others argued that holding officers accountable would weaken public safety. Trolls flooded social media with hateful comments, targeting not only Walter but also those who supported him. At times the negativity felt suffocating, but Walter refused to let it break him. Instead, he leaned on his support system: friends, family, and allies who reminded him why he was fighting. Mrs. Jenkins visited him regularly, bringing homemade pies and words of encouragement. Sarah, the journalist, continued writing articles exposing the smear campaign and highlighting the resilience of Walter and his supporters. Even strangers reached out, sending letters and messages of solidarity. One note, written in shaky handwriting, read, "Dear Mr. Thompson, thank you for standing tall when it would have been easier to stay quiet. You inspire us all." These acts of kindness fortified Walter's spirit, giving him the strength to push back against the hostility. With Judge Carter's help, he filed additional complaints against those spreading misinformation, ensuring that the truth remained protected. He also worked with Sarah to organize a town hall meeting aimed at fostering constructive dialogue between residents and law enforcement. The goal was simple: to bridge divides and build mutual understanding. The town hall took place on a crisp autumn evening. Hundreds of people packed into the local auditorium, filling every seat and lining the walls. Walter opened the event with a heartfelt speech, acknowledging the pain and frustration on both sides. "Tonight isn't about blame," he said. "It's about healing. We won't solve everything in one night, but if we can leave here with a deeper understanding of each other, then we'll have taken an important step forward." Following his remarks, a panel of speakers, including community leaders, police representatives, and victims of racial profiling, took turns sharing their perspectives. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, but also with hope. When the floor opened for questions, attendees engaged in respectful yet candid discussions. A teenage girl asked how she could advocate for reform without alienating friends who disagreed with her. An officer admitted struggling to balance enforcing laws with treating everyone fairly. Each exchange revealed vulnerabilities and aspirations, proving that meaningful conversations could pave the way for lasting change. As the evening drew to a close, Walter addressed the crowd once more. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "Real change takes time, effort, and courage. But if we commit to working together, if we choose empathy over fear, we can create a future where no one has to endure what I did. That's the legacy I want to leave behind." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the auditorium like a promise. Walter stepped off the stage, greeted by hugs and handshakes from people of all ages and backgrounds. Among them was Lisa, tears streaming down her face as she thanked him for inspiring her generation to fight for justice. Walter hugged her tightly, whispering, "You're the ones who will carry the torch. Keep going." In the days that followed, the momentum from the town hall rippled throughout the community. Local schools incorporated lessons on racial equity into their curriculums. Businesses pledged to support minority-owned enterprises, and the police department announced plans to establish a citizen oversight committee, a direct result of recommendations made during the meeting. While none of these initiatives solved systemic racism overnight, they represented tangible steps toward progress. For Walter, the journey was far from over. But as he walked through his neighborhood, greeting neighbors and tending to his garden, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He thought about the countless individuals who had fought before him, their sacrifices paving the way for moments like this. And he thought about the generations to come, inheriting a world shaped by the choices made today. One afternoon, as Walter pruned his rose bushes, a young boy stopped by his fence. "Mr. Walter," the child asked, his eyes wide with curiosity, "why are you always trying to help people?" Walter smiled, kneeling down to meet the boy's gaze. "Because helping others is how we make the world a better place," he replied. "Even small actions can create big changes, so never underestimate the power of kindness and courage, okay?" The boy nodded solemnly, then ran off to join his friends. Watching him go, Walter chuckled softly to himself. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. Together, brick by brick, they were building a foundation for a brighter tomorrow. As the weeks turned into months, Walter Thompson's story became a symbol of resilience and hope in his small town. The initial wave of attention had subsided somewhat, but its impact lingered like ripples spreading across a pond. People continued to talk about the elderly man who stood up against injustice, not with anger or violence, but with grace and determination. Walter had become more than just a victim of racial profiling. He was now a beacon of possibility, proof that one person's courage could spark meaningful change. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy for Walter, though he remained deeply engaged in advocacy work. Every morning he woke up early, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat at his kitchen table reviewing invitations to speak at events or participate in panel discussions. His calendar was busier than ever, filled with commitments to schools, churches, and civic organizations eager to hear his insights. Yet despite the demands on his time, Walter never lost sight of what truly mattered: fostering understanding and inspiring action. One crisp autumn day, Walter received an invitation that caught him by surprise, a request to address a statewide conference on police reform. The event would bring together lawmakers, activists, law enforcement officials, and community members to discuss strategies for creating safer, fairer communities. Walter hesitated at first. Speaking to such a large and influential audience felt daunting, especially given the complexity of the issues at hand. But after consulting with Judge Evelyn Carter, who encouraged him to seize the opportunity, Walter accepted. Preparation for the conference consumed much of his time in the days leading up to it. Walter pored over research papers, statistics, and case studies, determined to present a well-rounded perspective. He also reached out to friends and allies, seeking their input and advice. Sarah, the journalist, helped him craft a compelling narrative that wove personal anecdotes with broader societal themes. Lisa, the young woman who had championed his cause early on, offered feedback on how to connect with younger audiences. And Mrs. Jenkins baked dozens of cookies, insisting they would fuel his brain. On the morning of the conference, Walter dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit paired with a bright tie adorned with tiny roses, a nod to his beloved garden. As he drove to the venue, his heart raced with anticipation. Would people listen? Would they take his words to heart? Or would his message fall flat among the sea of policymakers and professionals? The conference hall was enormous, filled with rows of chairs and a stage illuminated by spotlights. When Walter stepped onto the platform, the room erupted into applause. Hundreds of faces turned toward him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to admiration. Walter took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. "My name is Walter Thompson, and I'm here today not as an expert or a politician, but as someone who has lived through the very challenges we're gathered to address. What happened to me, a 72-year-old black man harassed by police officers while taking a simple walk, wasn't unique. It happens every day in towns and cities across this country. But I believe my experience offers us a chance to reflect, learn, and act." Walter went on to recount the details of his encounter with the officers, painting a vivid picture of the fear, frustration, and indignity he felt. He described the subsequent fight for justice, highlighting the role of allies like Judge Carter, Sarah, and Mrs. Jenkins. Then, shifting gears, he broadened his focus to examine the systemic roots of racism within law enforcement and society at large. "We can't solve these problems by punishing a few bad apples," Walter explained. "We need to dig deeper, to confront the biases embedded in our institutions, policies, and even ourselves. That means rethinking how we train officers, how we hold them accountable, and how we build trust between police and the communities they serve. It means investing in education, economic opportunities, and mental health resources so that everyone has a fair shot at success. And it means listening, not just hearing, but truly listening, to those whose voices have been marginalized for far too long." His words resonated deeply with the audience. Heads nodded in agreement and pens scribbled furiously in notebooks. During the Q&A session that followed, attendees lined up to ask questions or share their thoughts. A young Latina woman spoke about her brother, who had been wrongfully arrested years ago. An officer admitted feeling conflicted about enforcing laws that disproportionately affected minority groups. A city council member pledged to introduce legislation addressing racial profiling. Each contribution added layers to the conversation, transforming the conference into a collaborative effort rather than a one-sided lecture. By the end of the event, Walter felt drained but fulfilled. As he mingled with attendees during the networking session, he was approached by a group of high school students. They thanked him for his speech and asked how they could get involved in advocacy work. Walter smiled warmly, encouraging them to start small, by educating themselves, engaging in respectful conversations, and supporting organizations aligned with their values. Change begins with you, he told them. Don't wait for someone else to fix things. Be the ones to make a difference. The positive reception at the conference bolstered Walter's resolve, but it also reminded him of the enormity of the task ahead. Systemic racism wasn't something that could be eradicated overnight. It required sustained effort and vigilance. To ensure progress continued, Walter worked closely with Judge Carter and other advocates to draft policy recommendations aimed at promoting accountability and transparency in law enforcement. These proposals included measures like mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and regular audits of police conduct. At the same time, Walter focused on nurturing grassroots movements within his own community. He collaborated with local leaders to establish mentorship programs for young people, teaching them leadership skills and empowering them to advocate for social justice. He also organized monthly meetings where residents could voice concerns directly to police representatives, fostering open communication and mutual respect. Despite the strides being made, resistance persisted. Critics argued that reforms weakened law enforcement or placed undue burdens on officers. Some accused Walter and his allies of exaggerating the prevalence of racism, dismissing their efforts as divisive. Tensions occasionally flared, particularly during heated debates at town hall meetings or online forums. Yet, Walter refused to engage in arguments fueled by hostility. Instead, he responded with patience and empathy, striving to find common ground even with those who opposed him. One evening, as Walter walked home from a particularly contentious meeting, he encountered a familiar face, Officer Daniels, one of the two officers involved in his harassment. Suspended from duty pending further investigation, Daniels now worked part-time at a hardware store near Walter's house. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, unsure of what to say. Finally, Daniels broke the silence. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice hesitant. I wanted to apologize. I know I messed up. I let bias cloud my judgment, and I treated you unfairly. I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the town hall, that change starts with self-awareness. I'm trying to do better, but it's hard. Walter studied the younger man, noting the sincerity in his expression. He nodded slowly. Apologies are important, he replied, but actions matter more. Keep learning. Keep growing. And remember, it's never too late to choose kindness over prejudice. Daniels looked visibly relieved, murmuring another thank you before hurrying away. Watching him leave, Walter felt a mixture of emotions, compassion, skepticism, and cautious optimism. Reconciliation wouldn't come easily, but moments like this gave him hope that transformation was possible, even in unlikely places. As winter approached, Walter reflected on how far he'd come since that fateful day when two officers stopped him on the street. The journey had been challenging, filled with obstacles and setbacks, but it had also been rewarding, bringing unexpected friendships, new perspectives, and a renewed sense of purpose. Walter knew the fight for equality was far from over, but he believed firmly in the power of collective action. Together, brick by brick, they were building a foundation for a brighter tomorrow. And so, as snowflakes began to drift lazily from the sky, Walter stood in his garden, watching the world transform into a serene winter wonderland. He thought about the countless lives touched by his story, those who had found courage to speak out, those who had committed to doing better. and those who still needed reminding that their voices mattered. With a quiet smile, Walter whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." Winter gave way to spring, and Walter Thompson found himself standing in his garden once again, surrounded by the vibrant colors of blooming flowers. The world outside seemed alive with renewal, a fitting metaphor for the changes taking place within his community. Over the past year, Walter's efforts to combat racial injustice had sparked a ripple effect, inspiring others to join the fight for equality. While progress was slow and uneven, the seeds he had planted were beginning to sprout. The local police department implemented several reforms inspired by Walter's advocacy. Officers now wore body cameras as standard practice, and an independent oversight committee reviewed complaints from citizens. Training programs focused on cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques became mandatory for all personnel. These changes weren't perfect. Some critics argued they didn't go far enough, but they represented tangible steps toward accountability and trust building. Walter remained deeply involved in monitoring these developments. He attended monthly meetings between residents and law enforcement, ensuring that promises made were promises kept. His presence alone carried weight. Officers knew they were being held to higher standards because of him. At one meeting, a young officer approached Walter after the session ended. "Thank you for pushing us to do better," the officer said sincerely. "It's not easy, but I think we're heading in the right direction." Walter nodded, offering a warm smile. "Progress isn't always comfortable," he replied. "But it's worth it when we see positive results." Meanwhile, the broader impact of Walter's story continued to unfold. The statewide conference he had addressed became a catalyst for similar events across the country. Activists, scholars, and policymakers reached out to Walter, seeking advice on how to replicate his approach in their own communities. Some even invited him to speak at national forums, amplifying his message to audiences far beyond his hometown. Though traveling wasn't something Walter relished, he accepted a few invitations, knowing the importance of sharing his experiences. One such event took place in Washington, D.C., where Walter joined a panel discussion alongside civil rights leaders and government officials. The room buzzed with energy as attendees listened intently to stories of resilience and calls for systemic reform. When it was Walter's turn to speak, he shared not only his personal journey but also the lessons he had learned along the way. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he emphasized. "It requires patience, persistence, and partnership. We must work together, across races, generations, and professions, to create a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." His words resonated deeply, earning him a standing ovation. Afterward, countless people lined up to shake his hand or share their own struggles. A grandmother tearfully recounted how her grandson had been racially profiled during a traffic stop. A college student expressed gratitude for Walter's courage, saying it inspired her to pursue a career in social justice advocacy. Each encounter reinforced Walter's belief that his story mattered, not just for himself but for all those who felt unseen or unheard. Back home, Walter's influence extended beyond policy changes and public speaking engagements. He became a mentor to younger generations, guiding them as they navigated their own paths toward activism. High school students often visited his house, eager to learn from his wisdom. Walter welcomed them warmly, offering snacks and stories from his childhood during the civil rights movement. He encouraged them to channel their passion into action, whether through organizing protests, volunteering at shelters, or simply having difficult conversations with friends and family. "You don't have to be loud to make a difference," Walter told a group of teenagers one afternoon. "Sometimes the quietest acts of resistance are the most powerful. Standing firm in your values even when it's hard, that's what true bravery looks like." Inspired by his guidance, many of these young people launched initiatives of their own. One group created a podcast highlighting untold stories of racial injustice, while another organized a food drive to support underserved neighborhoods. Their enthusiasm filled Walter with pride, reminding him that the torch of leadership was passing to capable hands. Despite the progress, challenges persisted. Racism wasn't eradicated, It adapted, finding new ways to manifest itself. Walter occasionally received hate mail or encountered individuals resistant to change. But he refused to let negativity derail him. Instead, he channeled his energy into fostering unity and understanding. He collaborated with local artists to host exhibitions celebrating diversity, partnered with schools to develop inclusive curriculums, and worked with faith-based organizations to promote compassion and empathy. One particularly memorable project brought together residents of all ages and backgrounds to paint a mural in the town square.
Titled Roots of Change. The artwork depicted intertwined trees symbolizing different cultures, with roots stretching deep into shared soil. Walter played a key role in designing the mural, incorporating elements that reflected both struggle and hope.
On the day of its unveiling, hundreds gathered to admire the finished piece, marveling at how art could bridge divides and inspire connection. As summer approached, Walter celebrated his 73rd birthday surrounded by loved ones. Friends, neighbors, and allies filled his backyard, bringing dishes to share and heartfelt wishes. Judge Evelyn Carter gave a speech honoring Walter's contributions, calling him a living testament to the power of perseverance. Sarah presented him with a framed copy of her latest article, which featured quotes from people whose lives he had touched. Even Mrs. Jenkins baked a cake decorated with roses, matching the tie he had worn at the statewide conference. Amidst the laughter and music, Walter took a moment to reflect on how much his life had changed over the past year. What began as an act of defiance against two racist officers had grown into a movement that transcended his wildest dreams. Yet, he remained humble, recognizing that his achievements belonged not to him alone, but to everyone who had stood beside him. "I never set out to be a hero," Walter said during a brief toast. "I just wanted to live my life with integrity and help others do the same. If my story has taught us anything, it's that no matter who you are or where you come from, your voice matters. Together, we can build a world where justice isn't just a dream, it's a reality." Applause erupted around him, but Walter's mind drifted back to simpler times. He thought about his parents, who had instilled in him the values of resilience and kindness. He remembered the mentors who had guided him during the civil rights movement, showing him the importance of collective action. And he envisioned the generations to come, inheriting a legacy of courage and compassion. In the months that followed, Walter continued tending to his garden, watching as each plant grew stronger under his care. It was a reminder of the work he had done, and the work still left to do. Systemic racism wouldn't disappear overnight, but Walter believed firmly that every step forward counted. Whether it was mentoring young activists advocating for policy reforms or simply lending a listening ear to someone in need, he committed himself to leaving the world better than he found it. On a sunny morning in late summer, Walter sat on his porch sipping tea and flipping through a photo album. The pages were filled with memories. Marches from decades past, recent rallies, and candid shots of friends and supporters. As he turned to the final page, he paused, smiling at a picture of himself, surrounded by high school students holding signs that read, "Equality for All." Walter closed the album and gazed out at his garden, now lush and thriving. He thought about the countless lives touched by his journey, the officers who had learned to question their biases, the students who had discovered their voices, and the strangers who had found hope in his story. Change might be slow, but it was happening. One conversation, one policy, one heart at a time. With a contented sigh, Walter leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth of the sun wash over him. He knew the road ahead would still have its bumps, but he faced it with unwavering optimism. For Walter Thompson, the fight for justice wasn't just a chapter in his life, it was a lifelong commitment. And as long as there were people willing to stand together, he believed a brighter future was possible. And so, with the scent of blooming flowers in the air and the sound of bird song filling the silence, Walter whispered softly to himself, "This is what hope feels like."